So as we come to the current end of the Scream franchise, I'm happy to say that as far as my opinion goes, it's official, there is no bad Scream movies. Pressure's on you for next year's Scream 5. Don't you mess this shit up for me. Scream 4 is a fun movie. It's not the revolution that Scream 1 was, it's not as good a sequel as Scream 2, and it doesn't have the strangely still heavily topical elements of Scream 3. But what it does have is a smooth sub-2 hour runtime that absolutely flies by. And while lacking the bite of some of its predecessors, it more than makes up for it with great characterization, a steady stream of self-referential humour and spatterings of snappy meta-commentary, a surprisingly pretty well-aged early analysis on the effects of social media on the wider culture at large, some great set pieces, and a new cast who slot in seamlessly with their older returning counterparts. While Scream 3 intended to close out the trilogy, much like every other horror, the franchise was never truly dead. With most of its original cast still surviving, and now an environment of reboot culture ripe for riffing on, it made a lot of sense conceptually to bring the franchise back. More importantly for studios though, all 3 Scream films made bank. Every one of them was a bona fide mega hit, especially for slasher films. Even the more critically divisive third entry, they all held #1 positions at the box office during their runs, and they all turned around over $100 million more than their budgets. The surprising thing about this film isn't that we got a Scream 4 after the series had quote unquote ended. The surprising part is that we had to wait over a decade for it. Other slasher series in the past that had ended, such as Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, waited a few years at most before introducing a new franchise entry. We should honestly thank our lucky stars that we don't have like 8 Scream films now, each one slowly degrading the series in quality, becoming further and further removed from its original material until it becomes some unrecognisable Ghostface shaped husk churned out on the yearly that only stops when it becomes so milked for all it's worth that audiences lose interest in it entirely. It's particularly baffling that this didn't happen, since the reason for Scream 4's eventual release was pretty much just, it makes money, let's do another one. Like, there was no real other reason for it. Often, long dormant franchise film continuations spur from an actual catalyst, like a rights renewal, or a creative conversation, or a performer's newly revitalised career. Halloween 2018, for example, came about because Carpenter was unhappy with the remake's portrayal of Michael Myers and wanted to do something with him. So he and Blumhouse actively seek to attain the film rights back, and filmmakers and Halloween fans David Gordon Green and Danny McBride approached Carpenter after this because they thought they had a really great idea, and that conversation spurred the film. With Scream 4 though, there wasn't anything like this. There was no incredible script floating around Hollywood that made people want to dust off the old IP. There was no huge demand for it, at least no more than there is for any other fan favourite horror franchise that lays dormant. It wasn't made as a particular reaction to a changing world or recent news story. It wasn't cashing in on any particular fad of nostalgia, like how nowadays we're bringing back a bunch of 80s properties. Previous films hadn't had a sudden surge in reinterest, and it certainly wasn't striking while the iron was hot. Literally, the only reason it exists, as far as I can find, is just because the Weinstein Company, yeah I know, said it would. In 2008, they announced that a Scream 4 would be made. More specifically, it was Bob Weinstein's idea. He apparently just thought it was time for another one. Whether that was Scream 4 or a remake was still yet to be decided. There was no script. Series creator Kevin Williamson, to my knowledge as far as I can find, was not yet attached, and if he was, he definitely only had an outline, as director Wes Craven would later say that's all that was developed when they called and asked him if he'd be interested in discussing it. Which of course also means that Wes definitely wasn't on board until after the announcement too. Which isn't actually too ridiculous. Big intellectual property films are planned for release all the time before they decide on who's attached to the project. I only bring this up here to point out that they obviously presumably intended for this film to happen with or without Craven and Williamson's involvement. Luckily for us though, they both signed on. And I'm especially grateful for this, not just because I love what they did with it, but also because, while I can't be sure of this, I expect that we'd have went down the remake route if Williamson hadn't came to Bob with an idea he liked, since that shit was all the rage in the 2000s and 2010s. I do think there could have been some merit in remaking a film like Scream, which was originally a meta takedown of the tropes of the slasher genre while being a slasher itself, in that it could have actually been interesting as a remake that self-referentially mocked remakes. Perhaps it could have even revolutionized the idea of remakes and reboots in the way that the original revolutionized its horror subgenre. I just don't think this could have been pulled off without an incredible team and script and full studio backing willing to take the risks and not interfere. And remakes are often by definition very risk averse. A continuation was always my preferred option, and thankfully, though you'd expect it to go the other way, a continuation is exactly what we got. And for my money, it's a pretty damn good one. The film opens with one of the most fun meta gags of the entire series, one that arguably even pokes fun at the series' own use of meta gags by intentionally taking it to ridiculous levels. It's the 15th anniversary of the original Woodsboro murders, and two young girls in a quick establishing sequence are murdered by Ghostface. But surprise! That didn't happen, it's just a scene from Stab 6, the in-universe film series that adapted the events of the Woodsboro murders and character Gale Weathers' book on them into a multimedia franchise. Fun little fake out. This scene from Stab 6 is being watched by these two characters during a movie night, who then argue over the series' quality when all of a sudden, BAM! It escalates into one suddenly stabbing the other for interrupting her movie experience, and title card. That was Stab 7. The characters were watching Stab 6 in the movie, which was Stab 7. Well played film, I enjoyed that, nicely done. We're then introduced to our first real victims, Jenny and Marnie, who are the ones watching Stab 7 on the 15th anniversary of the original murders that film franchise spawned from, and who even humorously reference how the opening sequence we just saw doesn't really make much sense. The two goof around and prank one another until, surprise surprise, in what is now our third opening sequence involving a sudden murder, they are killed by Ghostface, kicking off the events of the real movie. Sidney Prescott, cinema's most successful final girl, having survived the attacks of 5 different killers over 3 preceding films, is now an accomplished self-help author and is revisiting her old small town of Woodsboro, the site of the first film's attacks, as the next stop on her book tour. Also here is returning Deputy Dewey, now Sheriff Dewey, who seems to be enjoying his time as the big fish man in charge of this small pond, and his wife, fearless but ruthless reporter Gale Weathers, now Gale Weathers Riley, who originally wrote the book on the Woodsboro murders after her first-hand involvement and played a huge part in uncovering the mysteries behind the next 2 Ghostface murders, but is now losing her tenacity and bite, feeling both trapped by her small town surroundings she's committed to living in with her husband, as well as the massive burden of terrible writer's block as she tries to put her past life behind her and write fiction. Now before I go on, can I just say that, man, Kevin Williamson fucking knows these characters inside and out, doesn't he? I know he didn't write Scream 3, so I'll not give him credit for some of the natural evolutions of character stories that occurred in that film, like Sidney working for a crisis hotline for women, but even still, every single thing these characters do are so pitch perfect as to who they are. Like, every time I see them. Sidney's ending in 3, feeling comfortable and safe in putting the trauma behind her, then being developed here into her writing an autobiography / self-help book in vast contrast with Gale Weathers' exploitative sensationalist novel, is such a banger idea. Dewey becoming sheriff and relishing and feeling important, Gale struggling with the quiet life and forcing herself into this film's events after seeing Sidney on TV being successful in promoting her new book and arguably getting a little jealous. It's all so spot on. 10 years later from when we last saw them, this is exactly where these characters should be and exactly what they should be doing. It's so cool and so unusual for a slasher franchise that we're able to follow these recurring characters as they age in real time. This, I feel, is a really under-celebrated aspect of the Scream franchise, and one that sets it apart from probably all other slasher series. Scream is so heavily character based. So many slashers just cycle their cast like they're expendable, and if anyone does come back, they tend to be killed off fairly quickly or only appear for 1 or 2 extra films. But Scream has multiple people, all brilliantly realised from their very first appearance, that grow and develop and age throughout the years of the franchise's existence. It is so cool to watch Sidney, a character you already love, literally grow. Depending on your age when you watch the first movie, there's every chance you're physically growing up alongside her. It's really cool. I love how everything about these characters evolves, from their professions, to their fashion, to their personalities. It grounds everything with such a strong human foundation. Cannot sing this creative decision's praises enough. Anyway, enough celebrating our old cast, it's time to meet the new blood. When the murders of the opening are reported in, Dewey asks Sydney to stay in town while the investigation unfolds, after a search of her rental car reveals some pretty sus materials. This leaves Sydney staying with her young cousin from the area, newly introduced character Jill, played by Scream Queen Emma Roberts of American Horror Story fame. Jill and her friends Kirby and Olivia, as well as her cheating ex-boyfriend Trevor and a couple of film geeks from their school, Charlie and Robbie, pad out the film's main newcomers. And naturally, as Kevin Williamson characters tend to be in this franchise, they're all great. Believably teenage, sharp and witty, and written with a great deal of care and a topical flair. I particularly like the film nerds. They're basically this film's Randy. They give good reason for the Stab franchise to keep coming up as a plot point and give us all the nice meta set pieces and fun commentary. And as avid bloggers, they're one of the film's aspects that has aged the best. They've got this social media vlogging obsession and live stream pretty much everything, which as we know has really picked up as a trend, especially amongst this age group with the rise of Twitch since this film's release in 2011. En route to school, Jill and her friends reveal to one another that they've been getting creepy Ghostface phone calls, which is only the start of their worries, as later Kirby and Jill receive another phone call that warns them about a man hiding in the closet. With a nice little build of tension, the two open the closet to find nothing, only for the killer on the phone to reveal he never said it was their closet he was hiding in. And they look on in horror as he emerges in the room of their friend across the road and proceeds to murder her. Sydney and Jill rush to her aid, but they're too late and Jill is cut by the killer in the process before he escapes. After they're treated at the hospital, Sydney's agent Rebecca on her book tour suggests exploiting the current murders for book sales, to which Sydney responds to by firing her. Leaving the hospital in a sulk, Rebecca finds herself in a horror cliche, trapped in an empty car park, no one around to help, and oh no, her car won't start. Kevin, come on dude, you're better than that. What is this, a Friday the 13th movie? This is the kind of scene you used to make fun of. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, it might be a bit cliche, but it's effectively handled under Craven's well-experienced direction. But aside from the darkly comic ending of her falling onto a news van in the middle of a conference taking place below, where Dewey is assuring everyone things are under control, this whole sequence is played very straight for a franchise that made its name on cleverly subverting this particular brand of scene. Thankfully, the immediate following scene adds back in a bit more of that Scream flair. Doing her own little investigating, Gail goes to the school and enlists the help of the resident film nerds, who theorise that the killer is remaking the first movie, drawing parallels between the current victims and the original victims. This also gives Williamson a fun excuse to wax lyrical about how the horror genre has developed and changed since the 90s, and poke fun at the reboot-heavy culture of horror now. Side note, Rory Culkin is extremely good in this. Maybe it's because he just looks and sounds like a film nerd already, but he's really good at playing these sort of cool, sort of dweeby weirdos. Which reminds me, every time I see this guy, I want to make a video on the black metal biopic movie he was in called Lords of Chaos, which is a film that I absolutely loved, but that seemingly no one else watched. And those few who did not like it. I think it's good though. I should really get on that at some point. Anyways, the film goes on in much the same way as you'd expect it to. Bodies pile up, red herrings are ruled out, the killer gets their big reveal, and it all plays out very well. It's totally solid stuff. I suppose it is just a tiny disappointing that it plays so close to the formula, since Scream as a franchise's whole shtick when it's at its strongest is to subvert expectations and do something new. It's kind of a slight letdown when a fresh new entry 10 years later ultimately retreads very similar plot beats. They could have done something completely out of left field, like have the killer be one of the established cast members. Maybe Gail really needed to feel a little bigger than being trapped in this small town and chose a very dark path to get over her writer's block. I'm not saying that's a great, well thought out idea or anything, I'm just saying I would have liked the movie to really surprise and shock me with something different the way that that first film did. But ultimately, and I am about to spoil this here because I do want to talk about it, so you've been warned, spoilers coming in 3, 2, 1. There's two killers again. Much like the reveal of the first two films. One reveals that they were the real mastermind and just using their accomplice before killing them, just like in Scream 2. And of course, they are two of the new characters introduced for this film, namely Jill and Charlie. I do like their motivations, to be fair. They're both obsessed with fame and want to be this generation's Sydney and Randy. So they plan to frame Jill's ex for the attacks, kill him, and then act like they were the only ones who survived his massacre. Jill hated living in her cousin's shadow, show and wanted her own time in the spotlight. And this all connects very well into the commentaries and critiques of social media and the fame-obsessed generation it has created. Granted, when spelled out like that, it's a bit boomery. It's a little old man shouts at clouds. But it doesn't come across as super preachy or anything. Like the other film dork who's just super into live streaming and blogging, he ends up being totally innocent. And all of his social media obsession isn't really explored as some deep-seated problem with the youth of today. It's just a genuine way for him to express his interests in film. And you gotta remember, this was 2011. This was nowhere near as oversaturated and eye-rolling concept as it is now. We're talking long before those nauseating, phone-blaming and boomer-friendly art pieces you see all over Facebook ran with this concept at its least nuanced and most base level for 10 years and drove any conversations around this subject matter into the ground. This is long before the likes of that awful, and I cannot stress this enough, awful documentary The Social Dilemma, which for some reason trended hard despite being absolutely garbage. Man, I missed the boat on making a video on how badly researched and manipulative that shit was, and now that its whole phase has passed, I don't want to give it any more spotlight, but let me tell you, I hate that film so much. But Scream 4, on the other hand, was doing this stuff at a time when these observations weren't exactly uncharted territory as far as discussions go, but were still fairly new as thematic elements in major media. And here, it wasn't done in anywhere near as condescending a manner as it would devolve into over the next several years. The film even has what I would consider a pretty strong closing punch. After Jill kills Charlie because, as she puts it, the media really loves a sole survivor and she'll be way more famous if she doesn't have to share her glory, she actually manages to best Sydney, and then proceeds to beat the shit out of herself so she looks the part and seemingly gets everything just right. That is, until she finds out when she wakes up in hospital that Sydney survived her wounds and is recovering. There's a great bit before the final confrontation where Dewey works out she's the killer at the last minute, when Jill half jokes and half is shown to be already planning to capitalise on her newfound fame, when she makes a remark that Gail should help her write her upcoming book about all this, and that they've already got something in common with the matching scar placements, after Ghostface stabbed Gail in an earlier scene. The placement of the inflicted wound being something only the killer would know about. And as the eventual climax hits with Jill slowly losing her so close to winning hand, the three heroes, Sydney, Gail and Dewey, finally manage to best her, and after she dies in a fun and grisly fashion, we cut to outside the hospital where there's already a huge media scrum, salivating and hero worshipping Jill as the sole survivor of the most recent Ghostface attacks, essentially proving her point. A solid little closing punchline that does a good job of examining the predictability of the media's bloodthirsty approach to finding the best sensationalist angles in violent tragedies. On the nose, sure, a lot of stuff in this film feels that way now, but again, this was 2011. It was less eye-rolling then. And let's not pretend that when Black Mirror started airing later in the year and made these same observations, we didn't as a culture all collectively spooge at how revolutionary it was. And you know, with or without this little extra layer of social commentary, Scream 4 is still just a fun-ass film. It's got some great lines, some good comedy, a lot of fun throwbacks. It's just a damn good time. Yeah, your mileage may vary on how much you enjoy its takedowns of social media culture, depending on how much you've been talking to your technophobic uncle lately, but its genre critiques still make for fun observations whenever they crop up. And honestly, it's worth the price of admission just to check in with Kevin Williamson's truly great characters, and Wes Craven's directing on these things is always guaranteed to have some nice highs throughout. I'm really glad that he got to make this one last big hit before his tragic passing. It might not be the best work of his filmography, but it's great that his last film in Hollywood was working with a cast and writer he loved on a franchise he'd helmed the whole way through, and for my money, it's still a banger. Better than its predecessor, and a nice little return to a lot of the things that made the franchise fun in the first place. And that, my friends, is the end of the Scream franchise until next year's release. But since I can't time travel yet, that's going to be where our coverage of this brilliant little series ends. And so for tomorrow's video, we'll be jumping into our final slasher marathon to carry us out through to Halloween. And what better series to end on than the one named after the very holiday we're celebrating. So please, if you don't want to miss out on taking a little trip to Haddonfield to visit the original slasher icon Michael Myers, then remember to subscribe to my Only Dans at the red button below, and of course please like and comment with your thoughts so I can get that sweet algorithm nectar. And if you're really feeling like you want to support the show, then you can of course become a patron and get access to some cool exclusives for your troubles. More info at the link in the description on that one. Other than that, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you tomorrow.